Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our Healthcare and Life Science Breakout. I'm going to hand it over to Frank for our first session today. Take it away, Frank.
Hello, everybody. I'm Frank Notaf, Technical Director for Healthcare and Life Sciences at Databricks, and I'm very glad to have this opportunity to talk to you today about some of the work that we're seeing in the healthcare industry that can really go ahead and leverage data across the whole healthcare ecosystem to go ahead and improve patient outcomes. In my role at Databricks, I've been fortunate to lead up our practice across both the product side as well as in our interactions with customers to help them go ahead and leverage data that comes across many different fashions and forms, whether it's coming from an EHR, coming from a genome sequencer, coming from an imaging platform, or coming through a digital app that a patient is using on their device. When we look at the space today, we look across all the various different segments that we see. We run healthcare and life sciences as a combined team here, and we see this just awesome ability to go ahead and share data across all of these different segments that make up our healthcare value chain to ultimately improve care for the patients who fall at the center. When we think about some of these projects that we've been able to engage in and just really thrilled to collaborate on, we see a number of examples for how data crosses across here. One of the projects that we've been excited to participate in the past is a project that we did jointly with Human Longevity, who had implemented a process for taking whole genome sequencing plus whole body MRI data from an Alzheimer's cohort that included a lot of deeply phenotyped and research consented data that was collected through a government consortium. With this data set that blended genomic information that gave us insight as to a patient's disease risk, looking at some of the genes that are well known to carry up to 25% lifetime disease risk in these patients, they were able to then go ahead and turn to the images and pull out, using AI techniques, they were actually able to pull out the size of various different brain organs and use that to go ahead and build a model classifier that would actually predict disease onset 8 years before symptoms started to appear. So that's a really powerful example of data coming from the public sector where it's been collected through a research consortium and being used to inform a diagnostic test being developed by a precision medicine company. We also see opportunity inside of organizations to go ahead and leverage data across multiple scales. When we look at CVS Health has had this awesome ability to go ahead and use data that shows how patients are consuming prescriptions, how the prescriptions themselves are getting reimbursed through their PBM or through their insurer, as well as ultimately how the patient is actually picking up the prescription in the store through delivery, how that message that the prescription is available is being delivered to them. They were able to take data at the scale of tens of millions of patients, tens of millions of scripts, and use that with the power of machine learning to ultimately come up with personalized outreach methods that would actually drive increased treatment adoption. When they went ahead and they ran this machine learning system across both the interactive data plus the claims data, they were able to actually go ahead and get almost a 2% improvement in treatment adherence and ultimately driving lower cost of care and better outcomes for these patients. And finally, when we think about kind of the long process of getting a new drug into developed and available out on the market, we've been tremendously excited to see projects like the projects that we've worked on in collaboration with the Regeneron Genetics Center, where they've gone ahead and they've partnered with organizations, whether it is a large population health initiative like the UK Biobank, whether it is hospital partnerships with hospitals like some of the work they've done with Geisinger. They've gone ahead, they've built out a data infrastructure that is able to take this data, whether it's coming from an EHR, whether it's coming from a patient survey, the biospecimens, they've then been able to sequence that inside the RGC and then do large-scale statistical studies to identify genes that drive disease progression that will ultimately go ahead and hopefully become the next generation of therapeutics, leading to better outcomes and ultimately reducing the impact of disease for many of the patients. So, when we look at these sectors, there's just tons of opportunity to collaborate across all of these sectors. And we've been very privileged in our position as a data platform to go ahead and collaborate very broadly across this. In the time since we started our healthcare and life sciences team in 2017, we've now grown tremendously, and we're pleased to say that we will work with 8 of the top 10 pharmaceutical companies globally, 4 of the top 6 health insurers in the US, as well as numerous international healthcare agencies such as the NHS, CMS, and Health Direct in Australia, and multiple top 10 hospital systems. It's been really heartening to us to see this adoption of healthcare of machine learning and data intensive technologies across the healthcare space, and we're privileged to do anything that we can to help advance the reach of these technologies. When we look at, though, kind of how people are making decisions today and what are some of the challenges that they're facing, we've been able to pull out three big pillars that we think are going to drive data strategy for for healthcare companies that want to become really data driven. When we look at, at first, these mounds of data, and, many healthcare organizations have huge amounts of data. If you look at the average hospital system has about 8 petabytes of data. A big challenge is organizing this data so that teams inside of the organization can use it. In the biomedical research community, we talk a lot about FAIR principles. So, how do we make data findable, accessible, and interoperable? And we see this great opportunity for the FAIR principles to be adopted across the whole healthcare ecosystem, whether it's in the life sciences, whether it's in the healthcare space, whether it's by other organizations that come in to analyze the data. And ultimately, we think that with the right application of open source technologies, we can make this data not just fair, but reproducible and interoperable through the power of the open source ecosystem. And we can make it very high quality so that people can use this data very rapidly and ultimately drive improvements. The other big thing that we see is a great opportunity to mine this data at large scale, both to identify new areas that machine learning can improve care, but ultimately to go ahead and give us kind of a start down the path to doing machine learning and AI. Some of the things that we've been very interested to see are projects where people have taken large population health data sets, mined them at very large scale, and identified healthcare trends that they could develop interventions for. Some of the time, this is some of the work that we see on the on the life sciences side, like the projects that we've talked about at Regeneron and at Human Longevity. But we're seeing a very large adoption of a sort of data-driven way to drive health outcomes in the public health space. We were very excited to work in the past with CMS on a project where they mined very large-scale data, state-level claims data, and they were ultimately able to identify a variety of different factors that would lead to poor maternal and fetal health outcomes. And with the power of data, they were able to start thinking about, how do we design interventions to make these outcomes be better? What else should we be aware of in our data? What we're also really excited for is the power of open source technologies to make these workflows easier for people to go ahead and adopt in a context where there's a human in the loop. One of the things that we found is really interesting is a lot, in many aspects of the data intensive ecosystem outside of healthcare, a prediction will be served up without a human in the loop. An ad will be bought, a web page will be served, an A/B test will be run. But in healthcare, oftentimes there is a human in the loop. This may be a claims adjudicator, it may be a clinician, it may be a hospital administrator who has to decide where they're going to reallocate staff to. And we think that with the power of open source technologies, we can actually go ahead and center the human in the loop and give them more power over the decision that is ultimately made. It's not an AI algorithm making a decision, but it's an AI algorithm that is serving up a decision and serving up information about the context and made that recommendation to a human who can then go ahead and use their professional judgment to go ahead and apply that. So we see a lot of power in this space. And when our team comes in to address these problems, we've kind of lined up three big pillars that we work on. First, our team is heavily invested in building out infrastructure that makes it easier for healthcare organizations and life sciences organizations to pull all of their data together and to curate it. Some of the places that we've focused a lot of energy on is on the data ingestion side. Whether it's through projects like Project Glow or Project Smolder that help our customers take in large data sets in the genomic space with Project Glow and in the electronic health record space with Project Smolder, we see there's a great opportunity to build on top of the open source APIs that the healthcare community has built out, but to really make that data that comes in those open source APIs able to be read into high performance storage systems like Delta Lake so that people can then go ahead and access them very, very rapidly and very scalably from there on. Where we're then focused on is taking the algorithms that people are working on today and making them easier to run at very large scale. one of the things that we've been excited, again, talking about Project Glow, and Project Glow is a collaboration that we've done between our team at Databricks and the bioinformatics and genetics organizations at the Regeneron Genetics Center. One of the things that we were really excited to announce this summer was the introduction of GlowGR, which was a method that took a lot of these queries that we were running to find a correlation between a genetic data point and a patient's disease. People want to run this at the scale of hundreds of thousands of millions of patients. With the GlowGR method, we were able to take that sort of query that people want to run and make it 1 to 2 orders of magnitude faster to run. We see this as an opportunity not just in genomics, where we've been pleased to bring this out, but we also see the opportunity to do this in a lot of other contexts, whether it's biostatistics, whether it's working on medical IoT devices. And we look forward to introducing more technologies in this space that make this analysis really scalable. And finally, in the machine learning space, we see this great translation that's going to happen over the next few years as people take these ML algorithms that they're feeling more and more confident in and push them into regulated applications. When we actually look back to that workload that we spoke about earlier at Human Longevity, that happened in a regulated setting. And they went through great pains to go ahead and identify a very good quality control and validation workflow that would work for that sort of a model. We think that over the next few years, the adoption of ML in regulated settings is going to grow increasingly, whether it's in a clinical setting, whether it's in a med device setting. And we think that through the power of ML flow and some of the best practice workflows that we've developed, it'll be much more easy for organizations that are running clinical labs, that are building med devices, that are bringing new therapeutics to market, to use machine learning in these critical regulated areas. Ultimately, when this comes together, what we've been seeing is the adoption of this kind of end-to-end process that is built on top of Delta Lake and other open source technologies. What we've ultimately seen, both through the kind of easy to use conduits like Project Glow and Smolder, we're able to quickly go ahead and bring data in these complex biomedical data formats into Delta Lake, stored in a system that is easy to manage, has a low cost of operation, and that can scale out to truly petabyte scale data sets that people can query interactively. Once that data is staged in there, they can go ahead and process this data at very large scale and train machine learning models that they can store in the ML Flow open source toolkit, which gives them the ability to go ahead and introspect into these data sets, understand how these algorithms are faring, share these algorithms across their team, and ultimately collaborate to go ahead and build out, build out these models, share these models with other organizations, and really feel confident in their results. And finally, through the integration work that we're doing with both popular BI tools like Tableau or Power BI, as well as through the recent Redash acquisition, we think that there's going to be this great ability over the next few years for people to really serve up the recommendations that they're making to that human in the loop in a way that they can really, introspect into the recommendation. They can analyze the data that led to it, and they can get very comfortable with deploying these models in a way that people who are on the front line, the clinician, the claims adjudicator, the admin, are really able to engage with that data and feel like stakeholders in the process. So ultimately, we think that over the next few years, this will really drive kind of a new look to multi-scale medicine, where we're able to do, kind of operational automation that reduces the cost of running healthcare, reduces the cost of manufacturing, therapeutics and devices, ultimately drives new healthcare efficiency while maintaining the standard of care for patients, or hopefully actually increasing their standard of care. We see a lot of opportunity for population and precision health, where we may be learning from weak signals at an individual level that, when multiplied across hundreds of thousands of individuals up to millions and tens of millions of patients, become unmistakable and very hard to miss. We think this will have a big impact when we look at diseases that go underdiagnosed or misdiagnosed today, especially in the rare disease space. We think this will have a big impact in helping us better model the disease risk of an individual so that they can take steps in a preventative care setting to go ahead and address that disease before it, before it becomes a more serious condition. And we see a great opportunity to use this to drive the design and development of new therapeutics in the biomedical space. And finally, one of the things that I think we've really seen over the last 6 months, and I think this will be a real sea change in the healthcare space, is we're going to see ultimately very new and exciting ways for patients to engage with their care. We've seen just over the last 6 months the dramatic increase in prevalence of telemedicine and in digital and remote patient monitoring. And we think that ML technologies, like the technologies being deployed at CVS, being deployed at organizations like Livongo today, will ultimately give people new ways to interact with their care, give people new evidence that informs the choices that they as an individual are making on a day-by-day case, and will ultimately drive greatly improved health outcomes across all of society. So for us, one of the things that we're trying to do to enable this is the development of solutions accelerators. We have a number of these that are available today. And what a solution accelerator does is it couples, it couples a material that gives insight into how a problem works, how a problem is set up. And it then kind of dives into a notebook that provides a best practice example of how to go ahead and implement that workload at scale. For instance, looking at our pathology image analysis workflow, this was a workflow that we developed working with a customer who had digital pathology slides from cancer samples, and they were trying to go ahead and do machine learning on top of that to identify on that image of a cell, on that image of many cells, which were the cells that were cancerous. They wanted to go ahead and get that segment of an image so that they could compute some metrics about the patient's cancer that would help inform, some of the things they were doing on the genome sequencing side, help inform some of the recommendations they were serving back to patients. When we go through the digital pathology accelerator, we kind of walk through step by step the problem. What's the outcome you're trying to achieve? How you load the data in? How you use open source machine learning tools to go ahead and build that? And then what it actually looks like to store that data in ML flow, so that you can use that the next time you get a pathology image, to use that model you've trained to score that model itself, or to score that new image itself. With this, we see a great opportunity to take these best practice workflows that are being built out across the healthcare space and publish them in an easy findable and searchable way, so that new customers can come on, start to use these solution accelerators and identify an end-to-end solution much more rapidly than they may today. So we're very excited to be bringing these out, and we look forward to adding to the collection that we have over the next few years, and really building out an open source healthcare ecosystem that we can all participate in and get value from. So thank you very much for your time today. We look forward to collaborating with many of you, and we're very excited to play any role that we can in this massive data-driven transformation that's going on across all of healthcare and the life sciences today. And we look forward to seeing the adoption of these open source tools and technologies like machine learning to drive better outcomes for patients and reduce cost of care across the whole healthcare ecosystem. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Frank. That was great. Now I'd like to turn over to Steve Brenner, head of AI platforms at Humana, to give us his take on how they're scaling data science. Steve?
Hi, this is Steve Brenner. I'm going to talk today about enabling ubiquitous AI in flight. So I'm the Director of AI Engineering at Humana, and I'm very happy to be here to introduce you to what we're doing with ubiquitous data. A couple of the things I want to talk about. I'm going to tell you who Humana is. I'm going to talk a little bit about the digital health and analytics team that I'm part of. Then I'm going to define ubiquitous data and talk a little bit about the machine learning platform that we've implemented and Databricks, how it figures into that. And then talk a little bit about what exactly we're doing and where we're going. Humana. Humana is a very big company, the biggest one I've ever worked for. It's a Fortune 52 company. We've got about 65 billion in consolidated revenue in 2019. one of the things that attracted me to Humana, and I've been here about not quite a year yet, so still pretty new, but our mission is big. We are committed to helping our members achieve their best health. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we are going to do that using data. So Humana has bold goals. One of the things that we have done is, one of them is a bold goal that's a population health strategy to help the communities we serve be 20% healthier by 2020. And you might say, well, gee, how do you measure 20% healthier? Anybody can claim that, but we actually are measuring it using measures that that are well defined in the industry. And if you want specifics on that, look at our website. But it's we define that as the healthy days as defined by our members each month. So we do surveys, and this is how we gather that data, and we let them define how a healthy day is. And I'm going to talk a little bit more later about how we actually do tests to make sure that the programs we put in place are actually achieving their purpose. Now, challenges in 2020. Boy, this is the first year, I think, in the last century that has had 4 super disruptors. And, we define those as recession, pandemic, mass protests, and an intense election. And there's only been 3 other years in the last 100 that have had 3 out of those. I'm not going to tell you, I'll let you do that as an exercise to figure out what those were actually in those particular years. But big challenges need big responses, and this is definitely a year for big challenges. So just as an example, Humana has sent nearly 1 million meals to members at risk that we've noticed. And we have identified some of those through predictive models, but we also have people on the phone who just pay attention. And when they hear certain things for our members, they take action, and we get, we try to get results. And one of the things we're trying to do is get people food. Now, I'm a member of the Digital Health and Analytics team. So it's a team that was established about 2 years ago under Heather Cox. So it's really fairly new. Humana has been around since 1960, I believe. So this is, and we've gone through lots of transformations. This is our latest one. Digital Health and Analytics is designed to try and take advantage and use our thousands of data assets as an advantage for all of those bold goals that we have set for ourselves. Now, 2 years ago, the very first estimate that we put together had 1.9 million data assets. So as you probably have figured out, we don't really have that many. There's just lots of redundancy. And that's part of what we're about in digital health and analytics. We're trying to centralize the management of that data. So we, as a team, serve the data scientists and the advanced analytics needs for across Humana. And we define ubiquitous data in flight. And some of the things that ubiquitous data in flight needs are data governance, DevOps, we need CI/CD pipelines, and we need elastic computing and storage. So very much leading edge into the cloud is what a lot of what we're about. So let me talk a little bit more about the ubiquitous data that we have in flight. We have the first kind of data that you might be very familiar with is structured data, right? This is data in databases, claims data, members data, demographic data. We get financial data. Now, there is also unstructured data. We've got faxes, images, text fields in medical records, audio recordings and video recordings. We want to take advantage of those as well. So, but turning those into usable forms of data is, requires AI services. And that's part of what my team does. We do speech to text, we do natural language processing, we do OCR, optical character recognition, and we do an image analysis as well. So we're trying to extract value from this data by predictive modeling, machine learning, natural language processing, and cognitive AI services. So I want to announce, I should say, we just announced last week, Florence AI. Florence AI is the name of our machine learning platform at Humana. The name Florence AI comes from the city in Italy named Florence. This was inspired by, the name was inspired by the dome, and that was designed by the famous architect Filippo Brunelleschi, and he designed the dome of Santa Maria del Fiore. The reason that we picked Florence, Italy, is because it's the birthplace of the Renaissance, right? That ushered in a period of amazing discovery and innovation. And we feel the same way about our machine learning platform. We're ushering in for ubiquitous data, a cloud-based, repeatable pipelines, leading edge tools, and algorithms. And we really think that this is going to provide a renaissance in data analytics at Humana. You might say, why do we need a machine learning platform? One of the things, you might say, well, geez, there's hundreds of tools out there already for, doing machine learning. And that's the good news and that's the bad news, right? Because at Humana, we've got hundreds of tools that we're using for doing machine learning and advanced analytics. So what we're trying to do is eliminate the silos, and we're trying to bring a horizontal platform for use by the data scientists all across Humana. So, and we're trying to use leading edge and modern software practices for this platform. So it's a cloud platform, and it is, we're going to be automating and accelerating as much as possible, and we're doing this at scale in Azure. This is a platform that has been built by data scientists for data scientists. Now, some of the key components are a feature store. We have models that we build, train, monitor, and deploy, and we have starter code frameworks to really pave the data scientist's path to production there. It supports, and it's built all around Python and Spark, Databricks and MLflow. We've got templates that we've developed and lots of training materials to help accelerate the data scientists across Humana. There's on the order of somewhere between 200 and 300. Now, those are not in my team. I'm providing the platform to enable them to be successful. So our end-to-end ecosystem really promotes, open source innovation and enables the development and deployment of machine learning. We are transforming the workflows that people do, and we're providing a single interface to simplify the consumption of model outputs. Again, we're trying to provide a center of excellence. We're trying to be the hub of the Renaissance here at Humana. So we're trying to help our members achieve their best health and make their experiences simple and easy. This is really our Humana larger goal. And at the heart of this center of excellence is Databricks, which can handle the very large data sets and the complex operations that we need. Let me talk a little bit about a feature store. So feature store, in case you're not familiar, data that has been aggregated in a way that machine learning models can understand and use. So for example, how many times a member has been admitted to the ER in the last 6 months, and what's the average cost per visit? So, without this feature store, the data scientists can spend weeks to create and compute these specific things. Now, our current feature store, and it's still growing, has over 15,000 features that have been little snippets. Think of them as little snippets of code based on bringing together the data assets that we have from 35 different categories all of those different kinds of data that we're marrying together. And we're making those available in the feature store to for data scientists to develop predictive models. Now, so as I mentioned, Florence AI is groundbreaking because we've got a shared feature store that data scientists can use. We've got Databricks notebooks that are assembled into complex pipelines. These are reusable, they're monitored, audited, and validated. So we're really trying to make as much of this automated and put guardrails around these data pipelines. But this is an open ecosystem. I've been in the software industry for a long time, and it has evolved quite a bit since I got started. And I'm not going to tell you when that was, but it was a very long time ago. And I've come from a software development world where we've developed monoliths and proprietary software products and tried to do everything in-house. And I really like the current sharing that is going on in the industry. Data scientists, they can develop algorithms and they post them. A lot of open source software, and you might think, how can people make money and be successful with open source? Well, just look at Red Hat, right? Very successful company based on a free operating system. Okay, one of the other things about the ecosystem is that it provides, and our environment is, because it's cloud-based, we have elasticity. Our data scientists and our work groups don't have to compete for compute and storage. They can each start and run clusters that are suitably sized to accomplish very big problems in many cases. So why, again, I talked about open source. If we look at some of these things, we've got MLflow developed by Databricks. We've got TensorFlow, Core NLP, Spark, Apache Spark is of course at the center of many of the data manipulation algorithms and tools that we've got. And of course, Prophet and scikit-learn, and this is just the beginning. One of the examples that we're using very effectively right now is called BERT, B-E-R-T. It's a really game-changing NLP model that greatly improves the power of NLP systems. This was released by Google, and we're using it very effectively to get information from our documents. I want to talk a little bit about the power of predictive modeling. So COVID-19, some of you may have heard of it. So our data scientists in the last few months have been spending long hours with the data to inform how Humana can best help our members. What is one of the questions that they might ask is, what is the effect that social distancing has on COVID-19 infections? Well, let's look at a couple of visualizations here. And I know these screens are very busy, but I want you to focus on a couple of things. Look at the greenish area under the curve in the middle of the screen. This represents infected patients. The other number here that I want you to look at is, and it's a little bit hard to read, but it represents the rate of social distancing in place. And these are guidelines presented by, based on the guidelines for this particular region. And this is fairly recent. So if you notice here, you probably can't read it, but it's 72% in this diagram. And we were able to do a model that shows how it changes, how the area under that curve changes as we change and move up and down in the amount of social distancing. So I want to show you the next slide. And if you notice, going from 72% to 75%, right? A very small change, 3%, can have a dramatic effect on the area under the curve, which represents this is really active infections. I'll go back, I'll go forward. Look at that. It is pretty impressive what we can, the power that we get from some of these tools. Now, one thing I want to talk about is our predictive models. They identify the members that are most at risk, say, of avoidable admissions is one case. But to use that information, we need to take action. So somebody has an idea. how can we take action and improve that outcome? One example would be we could send a nurse to knock on that door. Or there's other ideas that people have. But how do we know that that's actually going to help, you might ask? We don't. So we do tests, right? It's not just some VP's good idea. It is, we actually design tests. And these are not software tests. These are tests in the sort of in the realm of experimental tests, right? So if you're familiar with drugs and they go through clinical trials with control groups, that process is the same process that we follow with when we talk about the tests that we design. So I've got a team that I work with. One of the leaders of that team is somebody who's worked with some famous behavioral economists. If any of you are familiar with Stephen Levitt, and who's written the book, he's a co-author of the book called Freakonomics, right? So what I'm trying to say here is people don't make rational decisions always. We have all these biases, cognitive biases. It's a very interesting kind of a very interesting field. If you want to read more about it, read up on Danny Kahneman and Thinking Fast and Slow, famous book. And he and Amos Tversky have really revolutionized that industry. So I've got, we have people here who are behavioral economists who help us design tests. And the reason it's important to design the tests to get the right experimental results is because we want to make sure that we're not playing into cognitive biases, and that we're going to be designing tests that are statistically sound. So we're developing a test and learn platform that will enable us to get the test results and be able to prove that the interventions that are informed by our predictive models will actually have significant effect on the results. Sometimes, I will say that not all these tests are, quote, successful. Some of these tests actually fail and show that, the idea was not good. So we're trying to build a data-driven organization with feedback loops. This is what Humana is about. I want to summarize by saying that Florence AI is our machine learning platform that we just introduced. It's been in the works for about a year. It enables Humana data scientists to develop high-quality predictive models from all the ubiquitous data that we have in flight. And this allows Humana to achieve our business goals, our bold goals, to help our members achieve their best health and make their experiences with Humana simple and easy. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve. Now back over to Frank for our industry leadership panel. You don't want to miss this one. Frank, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you all very much for joining us today. I'm Frank Notaf, Technical Director for Healthcare and Life Sciences at Databricks. And we look forward to today's panel, where we'll be talking to a number of industry leaders from the healthcare and life sciences industry about current trends in the space. I'm pleased to be joined by three panelists today: Joe Rumer, who is the Senior Director of Global Commercial IT and Insight and Analytics at AstraZeneca; Ibo Jack, the Director of Engineering at Milliman MedInsight; and Eric Kazmarek, the Executive Director for Data Engineering and Operations at Providence St. Joseph Health. To go ahead and get our panel kicked off today, I'd like to start by talking about, obviously COVID has had a traumatic impact on healthcare and pharmaceutical research. And I'd like to rewind back to January of this year. We'll start by walking through with our panelists. Please tell us a bit about your role and what you're doing with data and AI in your organization. And I'd love to hear a bit about what you've been focused on and what you learned during this whole process. So maybe Eric, would you mind kicking us off with a little bit of your experiences at Providence St. Joseph?
Sure. So at St. Joseph Health, Providence St. Joseph Health, going back to January, what were we doing? We're doing a lot of reporting, a lot of just regular BI. And then when the pandemic came upon us, we had to spread. We had to first stop everything that we were doing and then spread kind of across, more data sets. and look at our platform from a more comprehensive perspective. How do we combine different data sets? How do we get other data sets that we didn't have in our platform? So I think that was kind of the, how we switched from doing more traditional BI and data sets to really combining different data sets together and looking more comprehensively at some of the things that we were doing.
Excellent. No, that makes a lot of sense, and I think that I would actually imagine Ivo, being in the space that you are at Milliman, you've probably had kind of a similar experience. You all work with many diverse data sets. What was it like for you?
Yeah, so over at Milliman Med Insight in January, well, we thought it was going to be a normal year. So we had the typical our typical roadmap and our typical strategies and key things that we wanted to get done. And being from Seattle, the pandemic hit us pretty early in the U.S. And we really had asked ourselves some questions that we haven't asked before. And the number one question that we posed was like timeliness. It became okay to get an answer to a question 3 months ago, but when you're in the middle of a pandemic, people wanted answers now. And it really exposed the gaps we have in our data engineering pipelines, in our processes, in our validation, that we kind of rested on our laurels from our space, because we're kind of at the month grain, 6 weeks. Customers kind of want to look back at the claims history, and now they were really on it, and they really wanted to know, hey, if I give you encounters that haven't been fully adjudicated, like, will you look at them? And so we really had to take a step back and basically do the things that we thought we did well better. We needed to be very, very clean on the basic, our basic core mandates. And we had to start looking across multiple disparate customer contributions of data to look at trends that historically we normally wouldn't need to. And that's kind of what really shifted us in this post-COVID world, or during COVID. We're looking for these macro trends of drug use, diagnosis, DRGs, and just like what is happening out there, and what are people seeing.
No, that makes a ton of sense, and I think actually that kind of winds up being an interesting segue over to Joe. Obviously being on the commercial side of pharma during the COVID pandemic, everybody, when they think about pharma, they've been talking about the race to get new treatments out, new vaccines out. There's been this enormous focus on, kind of the R&D side of pharma. But how's it been like on the commercial side? I imagine kind of similar to Ivo, you're seeing a lot of changes in drug usage, a lot of changes there. How did this shift the world for you?
Ivo's story resonates really well with me. I mean, we definitely focus post the research and development side. I know there's a lot of emphasis on vaccine and vaccine development, but really our work starts the moment a product is approved into market in the commercial sales and marketing. And then the second the pandemic hit, what you had is a whole giant field sales force that usually went into doctors' offices, visited doctors, talked about our products, tried to answer their questions. They're grounded, right? They were not going to doctors' offices. They weren't having those conversations. The recency that Ivo mentioned changed dramatically. Like, we wanted to know daily, were there still offices open? Did the dynamics around the pandemic change? Could we have those conversations? But I think more importantly, we quickly pivoted to other digital tactics. That data that maybe was of secondary relevance before, all of a sudden became widely relevant. We wanted to know some webcasts we're hosting. How do we optimize? How do we get the messages out? How do we talk about pandemic? So we had data that I think we weren't really prepared to deal with being front and center, website traffic, digital data. It was just a very different world very quickly. And having people remote engage, much like, a video conference, the metrics you capture out of that are very different. And so we pivoted quickly. And I think Ivo's story resonates well with me. We had our engineering teams on the background trying to figure out and scramble to get some answers to people quickly on data that we weren't always used to being front and center.
Well, it's very true. I think it's been very interesting to watch from my side. The pandemic has I think, it's forced us in healthcare and the life sciences to really grapple with like what the digital transformation for healthcare and, and pharmaceuticals will look like. And it's also forced us to really reckon with questions around, healthcare interoperability. obviously we've all been talking about healthcare interoperability probably extensively ad nauseum for the last decade or more. But, I think during this last few months, we've discovered a lot of those places where we weren't dealing with disparate data sets as well as we thought, or, we could do interoperability, but only if we could do it slowly. I'm kind of curious, I think, Ivo, you had a great point there, and Eric, you did as well. What were some of the lessons learned on your sides, and what do you think is driving kind of the struggles, and how can we as a field be doing better? Like what's the low hanging fruit? Maybe Ivo, if you wouldn't mind giving your perspective first, that would be great.
Yeah. So on the interoperability, so Menon said we do a lot of monthly batch processing of customer data, and we get it primarily as text files, CSVs, and that works, and that's fine, and I think that's great. What it turned out is the second you needed to start consuming additional types of data, it became clear that the speed that a CSV file has from loading purposes just doesn't provide enough flexibility and metadata to do anything with second level of complication. And this kind of hit us, and we're like, man, like we've kind of built this architecture and it works, but it works assuming that the customers don't want to change things rapidly and see the outcomes of these data pipelines daily. Like we're still in that paradigm of like, let's do this once a month and pat ourselves on the back. And so that requires us to scramble and say like, okay, well, would it be consume native Parquet files or JSON files, or like what do we, like, how are we going to be able to provide that flexibility so that we can bring in this data and we can refine it and provide information that people desperately needed to answer questions, because businesses on the payers were wondering what their risks are, and providers are also saying like, I'm not getting patients because during the shutdown, all elective procedures and what Joe mentioned, like, facilities were closed that weren't, critical. And so I think the drive in our industry of more standardization and leveraging data formats that allow for easier consumption is becoming, I think that's definitely evident now. Like performance is important, but it doesn't matter if my file type performs if I can't actually read it in and get value from it. And so that's what I've noticed.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And, I think that's been an interesting thing for me, especially in some of the work that we do in, other parts of the healthcare space. Like, you start talking about EHRs, which, I know Eric's group does a ton of work with. You have kind of competing standards, whether it's the older HL7 APIs or the FHIR APIs. And there's a lot of discussion as to like, what does interoperability really look like? FHIR looks like an API that if you're going to design a web app, that's really good for, but it's not always clear it's the best one for analytics. I guess, Eric, on your side, what has that experience been like, especially working with EHR data, working with a bunch of other disparate feeds? What have been the lessons learned there?
Well, this is interesting because everything that my co-panelists mentioned definitely resonates, within our area as well, our world. So, the first thing that we learned is that we need to provide the data much faster than we were doing that before. So I said that we're doing a little bit more of the traditional BI, but now we needed to identify, for example, one of the things that we wanted to do, or our clinical groups wanted to do, is to start identifying COVID patients, for example, from the different diagnoses and things like that. And in order to do that, we needed to provide that data much faster. Another thing that became apparent is that we need to start working and ingesting data to be more interoperable from our EHR and HL7. And that we were doing that to some extent in the past, but now we had to speed that up, speed up the development, the parsing, pulling in new libraries to make sure that we can analyze the data properly. And so there was a lot of new development and new things that we had to try out to make sure that we provide the data in a timely fashion. and the different data sets, as I mentioned before, like AGT, ORM, that type of data directly from EHR.
Yeah, it's funny. We tend to think of EHRs as at least from the outside as relatively clean, standardized interfaces, but they have so many different interfaces below them, so many different feeds inside of them. It's it's been fascinating. It seems like an area where there's a lot of ripe fruit for greater kind of greater standardization, better open source packaging. We've been dabbling a bit on some of the open source packaging our side to make it easier to work with HL7 and Fire, and I think that's going to be a great route forward. Joe, I think I was actually really interested on your side when you started to talk a lot more about the digital data that you're working with, because, whether it's on the pharmaceutical side, whether it's on the healthcare side, we've seen this huge pickup in this. We had a lot of people that, a lot of people in the past have been saying, oh, this is going to be a big thing. We need to use more digital data in terms of, web traffic, understanding how patients are engaging with doctors, understanding what they're seeing in their patient portal. But a lot of the efforts, haven't been as hugely emphasized before now. Did you run into a lot of interoperability challenges when working with that? Or, what were some of the challenges that you faced there? Because this is a relatively newer data stream for a lot of us in the healthcare space.
Yeah, I think for us, I don't know that I would necessarily call them interoperability challenges, although some of the stuff that Eric mentioned, we're certainly keenly interested in when we want to partner with a health system and sort of help either guide patient identification or see where our products can benefit. We'd love that interoperability exists so we can partner closer. On digital, I think our challenges were mostly around the identity and seeing when we could figure out, do we have a meaningful thing, and a little bit of marketing discipline. There's a moment when you have a registration that you want people to register, and there's a choice: do you have people register or not register? And then it can create a very different experience for them if you know who they are and their preferences already, and you can serve up the right content, or they're anonymous and you let them be anonymous. And that debate around dropping off potentially people with the registration wall or letting them in and having a very different experience, one that's more personalized or not personalized, was a fascinating thing to sort of happen real time that I don't know that we were quite as prepared for as I would have expected. And I think it's something a lot of people will continue to struggle with as digital grows. The data and the velocity of the data was certainly a big challenge for us, and how quickly it came. And when you're talking about, the types of questions you'd ask about video, how far in did they get? When did they drop off? What content was being displayed when they dropped off? When did they stay? Like they're different questions than, how many prescriptions went out the door? Where were the prescriptions at? What's the managed markets formulary status? So I think it just challenged us in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And, I think one of the interesting things that you're kind of picking up on there is, there's this great opportunity to use digital techniques to really further patient education. Make a lot of this information more accessible, kind of steer people towards content that helps them take better understanding of their care, better understanding of the condition that they're diagnosed with. But there always comes up with this, kind of this challenge of helping them understand why this content was suggested to them. Like why did our algorithm say that we should explain this to them? What is in it for them? This isn't just advertising. We're trying to help them take care of themselves better and work with their condition better. When you're thinking about that, I know you've thought a lot about kind of transparency and kind of how we help people really understand that a bit better on their side. How did you think about the patient experience in this and being transparent with them? You kind of talk about that. Sometimes we set up a registration wall. Sometimes we let everyone in. How did that ultimately play into your data strategy and the way that you design these ML-based apps?
Yeah, I'm sure like a lot of companies, and I'm going to guess that this is going to be a common theme, we're doing a lot of conversations about AI ethics, about ML ethics, and how we make sure that our intent is always as positive as possible. We have, much like every company, a set of core values that we believe in and we believe in firmly, and it's very much about patient health and advocating for the patient and making more meaningful differences to their lives. And we're trying hard to keep that at the center. and having active conversations about potential bias in models. Does the data represent the right sort of information that should be presented? Are our models accurate? Are they drifting? Are we keeping an eye on them and making sure they're doing the best that we can? We're still very much in a human in the middle of most of our models too. I don't think we're at the place where we're made like the leap of the model is the whole answer and that's the right answer, because we firmly believe we don't have the full picture. But I think the conversations about AI and data ethics and bias in data are going to continue, and we're certainly trying to tackle them with our principles and values as an organization at the forefront of it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And, I think the good news in a lot of healthcare is that there are very natural human intervention points. There are very few things that get served up to very few decisions that get kind of made by a model that impact the patient without someone in the middle. But, I guess, I know, Ivo, we've talked about this a bit before, especially around bias in models, especially around representation and looking at model drift. You all sit in a very interesting position because you're working with this very, very vast amount of population health data. How have you all been handling it, and how have you all been addressing it? You sit in this fascinating space in the healthcare ecosystem that I think gives you a slightly different perspective on it. I'd love to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah, so within Milliman, we have some of the best data scientists and machine learning expertise, I think, in the country and or the world. And when we're putting together like a model, I think you got to be very, very careful in understanding that you can't rule out bias in a model because a human created the model. Now, we are hopeful that the data we use to train the model is unbiased, but that in of itself is at the mercy of he or she who collected that data to feed the model. And so the way I see it, the only way you can really adjust for the inherent biases of Ivo Jack creating this model and finding data to train my model on is that what Joe mentioned is that human intervention by, I need somebody else who comes from a different perspective, who views this problem slightly differently than I do, we need to have a debate about this model, A. And B, we also need to really ask ourselves, what is the impact of the information, the answer, the score, the rating that this model produces, and who is it actually affecting at the end? And I think those are stuff that you have to think about. And when you do, you find some of these really awesome macro models and AI that you want to do, and you realize, I can't really do this in good confidence and really understand and believe that the results I'm having are going to have a positive impact for people. But you can have models that are very specific for very specific use cases that might not wow people, but they are beneficial. And that's kind of the path that we've gone. We've had preliminary conversations about what it means to have AI ethics, but if you just think about it for a second, you realize that's a lot. Like, you don't really want this machine just saying, claim approved, claim denied, and just have it be this model, because that affects people's lives, right? So there's a lot more work that we have to do, and a lot more respect, and we're also and due diligence that we have to do, and we're interested in looking at what the rest of the industry is doing, what Eric and what Joe are doing, and competitors of all of ours are doing in the industry, to make sure that at the end of the day, we're all progressing towards the same goal. We want to improve healthcare for everybody. That's what we're about. We're all doing it in different ways, but ultimately that's our goal.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And, I think it winds up being kind of an interesting point as well. Really a core part in this is understanding metrics and understanding how an intervention that you're designing, no matter where it is, what are the metrics that you expect it to impact, and what are the possible things that could, what are the unintended consequences? I was just talking through this with a colleague this morning who had this great point that there's a lot of problems in healthcare that we think about where to us it seems like, we're going to make a model that makes a suggestion to someone about their course of care, and they will make a positive suggestion. Like, we'll suggest, we'll follow up with the patient, we'll give them a phone call to say, hey, are you taking your medicines? We want to make sure you haven't, you're not we want to make sure you're following your treatment so that you don't wind up getting readmitted to the hospital. And we assume that they're a rational actor and that they'll say, oh, thank you for giving me the phone call, and they'll stay on that. But there's a lot of places that we can fall into these, unintended consequences where, things go differently. I'm kind of curious, have you seen anything like that where you've seen models that impact metrics or impact results in an unintended way, or thoughts on your side?
Well, here's what I will say. I will say that when you're building this model and you have an idea, at the end of the day, you're building it from your perspective. So you said, hey, rational actors. So let's talk about that for a second. A rational actor is an actor that behaves in the manner that I deem rational. But what makes my definition of rational even more valid or invalid than Eric's or Joe's? And so, well, you're taking your medicine. Well, there's populations of people in America that have had terrible experiences, with physicians. They don't trust physicians. And you're like, oh, I don't think most of us put that in our model. They don't really believe in physicians. They don't trust them. We've had, there's certain percentage of populations of people in our country that, are basically have not been received proper treatment, or they get less pain medications, they get questions, they get bounced around because they're assumed they don't have insurance. These are all information that doesn't get captured if that isn't in your world. If that's not an experience that you know anything about, how can you capture that in your model? And how would you even look for data to train for those weird edge cases? Because you don't have that data. Claims isn't going to show it. The EMR is not going to show it, right? So that's kind of where I'm like, we have to be very, very honest with ourselves that we have a tremendous amount of computing. We have great vendors and partners like Databricks that can do tremendous things for us. But the second we project our definition of reality on a population, you will find out that you are very, very wrong.
Well, I think that's a really great point. We have, especially for us, we've done a lot of work in human genetics with some of the customers that we work with. Human genetics has a massive bias problem. It often selects from certain groups, whether we're looking at income status, whether we're looking at geography, whether we're looking at ethnicity. And this leads to, enormous problems in using that data to come up with better treatments that really work for everyone. And especially, when we talk about healthcare systems, all healthcare systems face, tremendous amounts of bias to their patient population, to where they are regionally, and things like that can make it, very challenging to go ahead and take insights from elsewhere and interpose them in. I guess I'm actually kind of curious, Eric, at Providence, have you all had kind of like similar conversations? I'd love to hear kind of the perspective on that side.
Yeah, from our perspective, it's more about the ethics of how we use the data at the moment, at least. Something that Joe alluded to earlier, and it's how do we protect the data? With all the increased volumes now that we need more data sets, more data overall to train our models properly. And do it right. How do we make sure that that we have the right computing available to us, and that computing is secure and the data is protected? So really, I think I would say that our efforts are kind of our efforts at the moment are going in that direction. That is not to say that we don't think about skew and bias, but we're kind of fundamentally, we want to make sure that we protect the data first, and then run the models second.
Makes sense. And data governance, I think, winds up being a big challenge across the entire healthcare spectrum. Have you seen any kind of best practices? I always think of it as we have this kind of challenging balance to strive for, where we need to keep. We need to have a very strong data governance program, both legally, to stay in compliance with HIPAA, but also just to maintain the trust of the patients that we're treating. but we also have, this competing goal of making sure that the data that we're using, or the data that we have, can be used by, researchers, data scientists, and anyone else to improve the state of care. Have you all had any best practices that you've developed?
So I can maybe say that there's a definite tension. I think I will amplify what you're saying, that there's a tension between, these two. We want to provide the best healthcare that we can, but at the same time, how do we do it, ethically and, and make sure that that we do it in accordance with, legally and, and in compliance with HIPAA and everything else. I don't know that I can share any best practices necessarily here. That would
no worries. Yeah, it's. I think it's a very. It's a challenge that many of us are evolving our strategies around, especially as time goes on. I guess, Ivo, I'm curious in the MedInsight team, how have you all been balancing that? Because you all, you have a lot of large population health data sets you've collected internally. You work with a number of external organizations. Does that create additional challenges, or does that kind of change your perspective on it a bit?
Yeah. So security and ownership and access to the data is it's a core tenet of what we have to build into our platform and into our data pipelines. And I think a challenge isn't necessarily, I don't know if that's the right way to say it. Like, this isn't, like, we're not selling candy bars here. Like, it's different if you're selling candy bars. You can, everybody can know who bought it, when they bought it. It doesn't matter, right? Like, we're one of the fundamental core systems of a civilization, like the healthcare system. And so we have to really, there's a lot of responsibility on our shoulders to figure out how to do what we do responsibly and how to show that value, not only to our customers who might be paying us, to the end users and patients of our customers, and to the regulators who need to regulate. Like, we have to show value to everybody in that ecosystem, and it's like daily. So if anybody here has a best practice, by all means, email to me, because I would want to use it. But I don't know if there's a one size fits all. It is a constant input into the decision making process that we do on a daily basis. It's like, well, how is this improving our goals? How is this aligned to our strategies? How does our customers, how does our end users, which can be different, right? How are they benefiting from us exposing this or not exposing this? And I think the pandemic has made it very clear that people want transparency now more than ever. Like, what are you doing, and more importantly, why are you doing what you're doing with my data or with this data, and how does it fit in, and what benefit do I get from it? And so these are things that we do in MedInsight all the time. We have a great security operations team that I partner with from an engineering perspective. We have a great legal team, and we're always kind of asking ourselves these challenging questions, and also working with the security and legal teams of our customers, because they also, they're showing up with, like, here are the terms of how you can interact with our data, and then we need to, so there's a lot of cooks, but I think that there should be, like, some people get upset about the bureaucracy, but I'm like, well, this is important, so it's going to take a while for us to get there.
Well, exactly. These are extremely hard and extremely challenging, many, problems that have many stakeholders. And, I always think it's very interesting to just see how many individuals come into play in this. To your point, you all work with a large number of organizations, whether it's, your clients, whether it's regulators, whether it's ultimately patients. And, I think that ultimately winds up coming across for many of us that are in the space. Joe, I'm kind of curious on your side at AstraZeneca. How have you seen this come about? Especially, I know you all are looking very heavily right now at how you increase collaboration both inside of AstraZeneca and with organizations outside of it. I'd love to hear a bit more about that and to kind of hear your perspective.
Yeah, I think Ibo and Eric said it great. I think it's attention, quite honestly. It's attention that I'm proud of our organization of taking a very restrictive mindset first and forcing people then to walk back from that restrictive mindset will tend to protect our data, and even departments within our own company are restricted from using a different department's company because of even the perception of a misaligned use. And we really fight hard to open up those doors. And I think that's some of the tension because we're leaving value on the table, to be honest with you, for the sake of making sure we're compliant, making sure we're doing things ethically, making sure we're doing things in a way that we can stand behind and there's no chance of perception of wrongdoing. I think as we start to enter into, wanting to partner with companies, like Eric may represent around how can we help with maybe reducing readmission rates, reducing real problems in the healthcare system, we're very much going to come from a mindset of we have to earn the trust. It's not inherently there. We're obviously in different sectors, and we need to make sure all of that information is walked in together and very, very much held either a broker, an organization in the middle, because we believe it, right? These patients entrust the organizations that treat them, and they need to make sure that data is safe and protected. And we have no interest in doing anything to break that trust. Once trust is broken, it's certainly not gained back quickly. So I think I'm proud. I would also agree. I don't think I have a best practice. We fight with it every day. We have the conversation every day about should we allow a little more access? There's value here. We can do good things, and even sometimes, good things that we'd love to do. But it's a tension, and I think it's a good tension, to be honest with you.
No, I think it's a really good point. And, one thing, though, that I will say, and, I think this is a great thing for us to touch to as we get to the end of our conversation today. One of the great things that you're bringing up there is ultimately the potential that's driving us forward is the ability to bring in data from multiple stakeholders, whether it's a hospital system, whether it is a pharma company, whether it's digital patient engagement data, and use that to, solve problems that we can't solve today. I'm kind of curious for you, when you look at, some of the big challenges that you're looking at the next, 1 to 3 to 5 years, what would you say are going to be the biggest things that you're looking to solve by blending multiple data sets together and collaborating on data, both with stakeholders internally and stakeholders externally? Where do you see that going for you, Joe?
Yeah, I think for me, the rise of the ability to get some of this compute we've touched on and really get to some data that was too large to deal with was just problems that we couldn't solve. We've got a ton of work that's happening in our research and development in this space, but in commercial, really, we're hoping to find some of these partnerships and really bring some of the expertise we can bring on our disease states, the therapies, and help treat patients, find those patients that are undertreated, that may be able to be treated differently and help have a different conversation, and hopefully just raise some awareness of improving patients' lives. I mean, there is a ton of available resources now for us to really make a change with the data and make some informed decisions, or at least guide those decisions. We'll never, ever believe that we have all the information to make the decision, but help people maybe question a decision, think differently, challenge a little bit of a decision in healthcare would be a great outcome for us, and there are problems that we want to partner and solve.
That makes a ton of sense. And, I know Eric, being at Providence, Providence is an interesting organization. It's extremely collaborative. You have a large research, kind of a large research and a large data science practice inside of the hospital system. What do you see on your side as some of those big areas that you all might be looking to kind of, do new data blending, kind of learning from some of the lessons of the pandemic around data recency and data availability? What kind of is showing up on your future looking horizon there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that more and more we're looking at sharing data with from our external partners and different vendors. This is something that we try to do in-house, I would say, in the past. Of course, we had to share data externally for compliance, for instance, but not so much to add to our data sets. And I think what we need more and more is those external data sets to enrich our own internal ones. So we're definitely looking in that direction. I think what our other co-panelists said, they deal with other data sets with from other vendors. They are our vendors. So basically they would like access to our data. So what we're trying to understand better is how do we share the data then back to AstraZeneca, for instance, and how do we collaborate better? Again, within the prescribed parameters of HIPAA and PHI data and working with those. How do we de-identify the data that we share? But at the same time get some benefit from that back into our healthcare system. So I would say it's enriching the data, blending the data, and then sharing the data. I'd say these are the next things for us.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I know, we've seen some very exciting partnerships between, major hospital systems, large AI groups, and, other healthcare research teams that have driven some really interesting outcomes for patients. So I think, I would definitely believe that. And it's definitely been interesting for me, when I look at a lot of the work that we do in the pharma industry. Pharma's been very quick to uptake, I think to the point that Joe has had, pharma often gets a lot of data from hospital systems, or from health insurers in the form of real world evidence, in the forms of claims that they've bought, but we haven't seen necessarily as much of that flowing back into the hospitals. And I think that'll be a very exciting space to see over the next few years. And, I think, going over to Ivo, I'd be curious again on your side, kind of where you see that. I mean, one of the things that I could easily imagine is, one of the great things that having more external data sets allows us to do is it does allow us to evaluate how models perform on different populations that are different from the populations that we're working with on a day-by-day basis. So I could see that as an avenue for some of the things that we had talked about earlier. But I'd love to hear your perspective. Where do you see kind of the art of blending data and the art of using it to drive better outcomes going over the next 3 to 5 years?
Oh, well, I think that's the name of the game. Like I mentioned earlier, the diversity of the data that we are going to be responsible for is going to grow by leaps and bounds, and the value that we have to drive to what I said previously, to our customers and to the patients or the members, is we have this vast amounts of data. They're sharing it, like Providence is sharing their data with us, and they're expecting to get a return. They're expecting to get additional value added information from us. And so it is our job to always keep that top of mind to build that trust. They're giving us something because they're expecting what they gave us back and then a little extra. And when we are looking at surveys and different, EMR, EHR data, and just trying to be like, how are we going to put together some sentiment data? We want to tackle some more social determinants. It's like all of these angles require massive amounts of data that, quite honestly, we didn't have the capability to handle 3 or 4 years ago. So you didn't have to worry about it. It was easy. But now that's there is a treasure trove of value that we have to mine, and I'm excited to do it. I think everybody here is excited for for that challenge, and we have to overcome. We have the bias issues that we have to overcome. We have the ethics that we need to always work. You don't overcome ethics. It's always evolving. But that's what I see. I say 3 to 5 years, the diversity of data is going to be 10x more. What people expect you to do, the transparency that they want to know what you're doing with their data. It's going to go up, and the regulations are going to increase, and that's all going to happen in the next 3 to 5 years.
It makes a ton of sense, and I think there was a really interesting comment that you made a bit earlier today, where you're talking about the opportunity to train, instead of having kind of one model to rule them all in healthcare, you have the ability to train many smaller models that attack these small parts of the issue. And when we blend all of these different data sets together, when we look at all of the different fundamentals, whether it is social determinants of health, whether it is where a patient is located, whether it is what their condition is, and how they're interacting with information about kind of how they are getting digital information about their condition, about the therapeutics that are available to them. When we blend all of those together and we work on each of those problems piece by piece, bit by bit, we can ultimately improve the value of healthcare for everyone and hopefully drive better outcomes for our patients. So, it was really exciting to talk with you all today. It's always wonderful to have a panel like this that blends different pockets of the healthcare ecosystem, the healthcare value chain together. And it's always really encouraging to me to see that we're all pushing towards kind of a single consistent goal with, many of the same goals and approaches underlying. So thank you all very much for joining us today on our panel. I really appreciate the opportunity to have a conversation with you all about these topics. And thank you all to our audience for joining us today.
That was great. What a lot of really good insights. I want a big thank you to our panelists and to Frank for sharing those stories. And that's all we have for today's session. Thanks again for everyone for joining us, and thanks to our speakers. Look forward to seeing you next time.